So the book of Proverbs tonight. Oh my gosh, I forgot my glasses. So the book of Proverbs tonight, and let's start with what is a proverb. A proverb is, we all know what it is, but just for fun, it's an adage, a maxim, a common, pithy, wise saying, a witty, rhythmic, traditional truism, a compressed instruction in artistic form. Now, we're already used to this in Psalms and so forth. It's another series of bicolae, typically. So you have, two thoughts that kind of go together like the two dots of a colon. And that's typically the way they are, the way they're written. That's this Jewish artistic poetic form that you find Proverbs written in. And proverbum, what the heck is that? Prepositional prefix pro is forward. And verbum, hopefully everybody knows, is a word. So a word put forward is basically what it is, but in a timely way. And we all use Proverbs all the time in our daily speech without even realizing it. Better late than never. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Action speaks louder than words. All good things must come to an end. A picture's worth 1,000 words. Beggars can't be choosers. And then I just made one up. The soul needs prayer like the body needs air. I made up my own proverb. So for more information about that, watch my rap video on my YouTube channel. Made a whole rap about that proverb, basically. So proverbs are part of our way of life. Part of every human culture, I'm sure, has proverbs. Different kinds of proverbs. Hey, here's some that come from the book of Proverbs that are part of common knowledge, just the popular culture. Spare the rod and spoil the child. Pride cometh before the fall. That straight out of the book of Proverbs, and that is like so common and so true. Iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another person like iron sharpens iron, right out of the book of Proverbs. So Proverbs are a part of our life. Now, the book of Proverbs is interesting. It's written by many different authors, and that's not just scholarly, supposition or, theories about who wrote what based on some parsing of the grammar or something. And, you get all these theories about things that scholars devise. But in this case, the book of Proverbs has multiple authors, and it's stated very explicitly in the text who the authors are. So it begins with Solomon, contributed a lot of them. And but then you also have, not only Solomon referenced as an author, far and away the largest contributor to the book of Proverbs, but two anonymous sages. These sayings of the wise handed down from two anonymous sages who could very well be Gentiles. That's what's so interesting about this book. That Solomon gathered some of these things from Egyptians and Arabians. And they're incorporated in the sacred scripture from Gentile civilizations contributed to the sacred scriptures. Who would have thought? It's really cool. Then in chapter 25, scribes who are working for King Hezekiah are explicitly mentioned as putting down or recording some of these sayings of Solomon and so on. So two largely unknown Gentiles, Agor and King Lemuel. Some people think that's, an Egyptian, or is it Solomon? Because it could be another name for Solomon. I don't know, but I've heard both. But you have anonymous sages that are probably Jewish, a couple of those, and you have these two largely unknown Gentile contributors to the book of Proverbs. That is, to me, really cool. Because it speaks to the universality of the book of Proverbs, of wisdom literature, period. Because it extends beyond all cultures. It kind of, a lot of it appeals to the natural law and just to common sense, to the universal human conscience, the law of God written in the human heart. So it's kind of universal. Now, this is Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is like the foundation of this Solomonic pentology. So these 5 works of Solomon: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, the book of Wisdom, and the book of Sirach, even though Solomon didn't write them all. He is very much the genius behind them, or, kind of the tradition is Solomonic. He was a great gatherer of wisdom. Remember, he asked for wisdom when God asked him, what do you want of me? And he said, I want wisdom, a discerning mind. And God was very pleased with that. And we know from the New Testament and from the Old Testament that the Queen of Sheba came to seek him out for his wisdom and was very impressed by him. And so there's this wisdom tradition that is associated very deeply with Solomon, the son of David, just as the Psalms are attributed or associated with David. So that whole tradition, even if he only wrote half the Psalms, hey, they're still written in this Davidic way. They have this Davidic ring about them. And all these works of Solomon, they're kind of Solomonic pentology, so universal. Why universal? Well, it's kind of neat that this is the first time now this universal kingdom, it's become internationalized under Solomon and David. Okay, it's beginning to extend to all these surrounding nations. This period of history of the ancient Near East, there was an ascendancy here of Israel. Whereas, usually in history it was like either dominated by the some kingdom or civilization up in Mesopotamia, north of Israel, or in the south in Egypt. And they were the two poles around those two rivers, Tigris and the Euphrates and the Nile River. These two civilizations built up around those rivers. One was always had the hegemony, had the power, leverage, politically, militarily, economically, and so on. But and this was there was a lull in the action here in divine choreography in those two, the northern and southern civilizations, and Israel ascended under Solomon. The height of her ascendancy was under Solomon, and it was a truly international kingdom at that point. And so Solomon had 700 wives, he had 300 concubines. And he, 700 wives, 300 concubines. A lot of that is for political incentive, but I mean, come on. It's just kind of absurd at a certain point. But I don't think he had their names memorized. And I mean, it would probably be, you have to make appointments or something. You have to have a secretary, keep it all straight. But he, so he, it's not very wise. That's what's so ironic about these books and about his reputation for wisdom, because so much of what we're going to hear about promiscuity and just sexual immorality and so on, and loving of your wife and all this kind of thing, faithfulness, fidelity to your wife, and this guy the great master of wisdom, and he, So, very much it represents kind of this outreach, this bridge, this wisdom of Solomon is a wonderful bridge to the nations. And this would prove fortuitous for the early church big time, because it was very popular, and especially in this Greek culture, this wisdom literature of the Old Testament was very appealing because of its universality. People could relate to it from all times, places, cultures. So that really is kind of an important thing to notice at this period in history during this empire, literally, the Solomonic imperial this international era of Israel's history. This wisdom of Solomon played a pivotal role of evangelization in a certain sense, and cross-pollination with these other civilizations and cultures. But what's interesting is there's almost, in the book of Proverbs, no explicit reference to the historical or prophetic books. I mean, there's mentions of the law a couple times, the importance of the law of God, but it's just kind of oblique. It's not really explicit. There's no mention of any of the great biblical heroes or prophetic books or anything. The covenant, the law, salvation. It's like missing from the book of Proverbs. Mount Sinai, anything having to do with cult, liturgy, missing. So that's just interesting that you don't find that. But there is a theological background to this book. That's undeniable. God is present, and he looks into the hearts of all of us and sees all our deeds. And it comes off, it's all throughout the thing as you're reading through the book of Proverbs. Not saturated with theology, but it's all throughout. And you come across little tidbits where God discerns our hearts from afar. And he knows the heart of man. And he judges all of our deeds. And he's displeased when we treat the poor unfairly, or when we act with injustice and all kinds of things. So he sees all our actions and deeds. So God is very much a part of the book of Proverbs. Of course, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, is the most obvious example of that. The fear of the Lord, which we're going to talk about a little later, to kind of press into that. What does that really mean in biblical terms? The fear of the Lord, because people have hang-ups about that, but the idea that the fear of the Lord undergirds and is at the very origin of the pursuit of wisdom. But mostly, the book of Proverbs is observations and exhortations based on the natural law that's universal. So some people think it's boring, that this is just platitudinous and dull truisms that we all know already, and it gets ignored, the book of Proverbs. Really, it's extremely practical, and it's extremely democratic. It's accessible to everybody. It kind of brings the sacred into the secular, because there isn't any secular life. It's not like we can compartmentalize our life and bracket off the sacred and the secular, our secular life and our sacred life. We're supposed to have unity of life. God is supposed to penetrate all aspects of our life. And they are to become sacred, whether or not we work for the federal government or whatever. Everybody, every place we go, everywhere we go, we should have this unity of life, that we are God-fearers. We live according to his ways. So it's democratic. and practical, as opposed to some sort of Gnosticism. It's a real antidote to Gnosticism, which is really, you have these enlightened few, the Illuminati, who have all this mystical wisdom that is really impenetrable stuff. You read it and you're like, what the heck are they talking about? It's not very practical and concrete. It's kind of esoteric. Whereas this hits you where you live. I mean, literally. This is like everyday life here. Practical and concrete. And exoteric. So it's the exact opposite of some esoteric thing that's only accessible to the few enlightened ones, Illuminati, who possess the gnosis, and everyone else is in awe of them. No, this is for every man. The book of Proverbs is a must read. And it basically, you have the fool and the wise person, but it's very important when they say fool to realize the fool for the Jew is not necessarily somebody with a low IQ. It's not an intellectual assessment of your intellectual powers. It's a moral thing. It's a moral statement. You can have all kinds of letters after your name and be have a super duper duper IQ, be wicked smart, and be a fool in your life. If it's not lived according to God and His ways, according to your nature, and what's truly good and fulfilling for us. And that's what wisdom seeks, to live in accordance with what's truly good and fulfilling for us. God's ways. His moral law is more real than the physical laws that govern the universe. They can be suspended. God's laws cannot. They are immutable. Any universe many of these truisms apply to any universe. God could create multiple universes. There could be a multiverse, whatever. But anywhere you go in the multiverse, whatever universe you go into, these are going to be true. And they can't be changed for the most part, many of them. Now, they are objectively true and universally true, and what's so nice and refreshing is intelligible by all. You can teach these things, many of them to a kid can grasp these things. So, man, if families got together and read the book of Proverbs together, what an amazing thing. To let that form and shape their life together, their familial community life, because so much of this has to pertains to relationships with our dealings with others and with ourselves. And it's just so packed with insight and wisdom into healthy relationships and healthy living. Bottom line is you can't cheat nature. So there's no way around God's objective universal laws. There's just no way around it. We're not the creator, and we can't create some alternate universe where these things don't apply. You can't run from it. You can't escape from it. And we can try to live in some state of denial about these things and say, whatever, life is like Macbeth, or whatever that line from Macbeth. Life is just a story told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, but signifying nothing. This meaningless nihilism, and say, this imposed, old-fashioned, obsolete, irrelevant morality and all this. I don't need this, and adopt some attitude like that. But, that's just seeking refuge in lies. There's a great quote from Isaiah that I love, where Isaiah is like, look, man, your refuge of lies, God is going to overwhelm it. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers, because we have made lies our refuge, and in falsehood we have taken shelter. Guess what? The flood is going to sweep away. The waters will overwhelm the shelter, Hail will sweep away the refuge of lies. There's no way around it. It's going to catch up to us. You can't cheat nature, and this really is the natural law. And if you try to buck this system that's inscribed into the universe of God and his ways, which flow from his very being, God's ways, they're immutable, and you're just going to hurt yourself, destroy yourself. You hate yourself if you ignore these things. You despise yourself. It's literally what the book of Proverbs says. So no one wants to do that. Now, the two ways to just pare this thing down and boil it down, Psalm 1. Back to Psalm 1 again, and the two ways. The way that leads to destruction, the way of the wicked leads to destruction. The way of the blessed leads to life. The way of the righteous, those who accept these ways of God and live according to their nature are blessed and find life. Now, let's look at a couple Proverbs here. First of all, chapter 4, verse 18. The path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. Boy, that sounds an awful lot like Matthew chapter 13. This series of parables our Lord explicates, and he says that the righteous... Let's hear what he says about the righteous. Sounds so similar. As you're reading along the book of Proverbs, you're like, didn't somebody else say this in the New Testament? It's going to happen to you all the time. Our Lord says at the end of time, the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. The righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father at the end of time, the resolution of all things. Sounds an awful lot like Proverbs 4:18. The path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. What about the wicked? The way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. Now, folly is chasing us around all the time. We're born with folly. The book of Proverbs is pretty clear about that. Little kids are just prone to it from day one. And you watch them grow up. No. And they're just little rebellious natures. And they're just filled with insatiable desires and appetites for everything. They don't know how to curb those desires. And they're just filled with self-centeredness, selfishness, pride, all this stuff. They're just riddled with it, and they have to be disciplined. And that's the job of the parent, if they love them, to discipline them. So folly is, something that we have to fight to overcome. And as we gain wisdom, what we notice, and I like this expression here, is that, we begin to see through the snare. Like when we teach our children, not just, don't do this because I told you this, just merely based on my authority. It begins there, but eventually what's better is the kid gets older and can reason their way through this thing and follow the equation out all the way to the end and sees these two paths. They see through the snare and they avoid the ambush of that folly brings in their life. Things that are opposed to God and his ways. And soon they will become like the bird. I love this concrete expression, this poetic, artistic expression. In vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. Isn't that great? That's instinct for self-preservation, man, and enlightened self-interest. Once that takes hold, that's when these things are written in your heart, which is an expression drawn from Proverbs, that wisdom and the commands of God must be written in our hearts. I love that. once we see through the thing and become convinced interiorly and see how good and desirable God and his ways are, then we become self-motivated and it becomes incentivized for us. That's the moral education that we need to instill in children and in all of us. Ultimately, we need to keep working towards that until we see through all and see the net being spread out there, and we just like, there's no way I'm walking over there. I see what you're doing. I'm not going over there. Whereas the wicked set an ambush for their own lives, Proverbs says. Now, tough love is what's going to be required. Tough love. And because, God lets us, like the prodigal son, go out there and experience the consequences of our sinful actions. And this is part of his paternal ingenuity, to borrow an expression. It's, he lets us find out for ourselves sometimes. Pain's a good teacher. And they shall eat the fruit of their way. We're going to have to sleep in the, what's that expression? You have to sleep in the bed you made, or make the bed you sleep in, or what's that? Sleep in the bed you made, or whatever. We got to put up with it, whatever, okay? And we're going to reap the whirlwind. If we sow the wind, we're going to reap the whirlwind. It's like, we'll find out. So if your kids, after you've done everything and you're blue in the face, you've given them all the lectures 1 through 84 multiple times, and you can't express it any more succinctly, any more persuasively to them, you've done everything, all your parental responsibilities and duties are fulfilled to the best of your ability, and they go off to college, and you're like, okay, they're flown from the nest. You can entrust them to this paternal ingenuity, because your words are going to stick in their brain, and they're going to find out you were right. When they experience some of the consequences of sinful action and behavior in themselves, or seeing it in others around them. As we live our lives, these things, once they get lodged in there, you can't shake them out. That's why we got to get them in there and train people, particularly in the home. It's a school of virtue, the Catechism says. The home should be a school of virtue. So now, I want to quote this movie that I really, really like. Okay, this movie I can't say enough good about. I know I'm running the danger of like building it up too much and then you don't like it. But there's this movie that I have high regard for called Changing Lanes. I think it came out in 2002 or something like that. Man, it just, Hollywood every once in a while gets it right. And they hit that thing right on the sweet spot and knocked it out of the ballpark. I cannot believe it. This came out of Hollywood. But Samuel Jackson is phenomenal. And not Brad Pitt. Who's the guy that played Batman in the more recent ones?
Christian Bale?
Not Christian Bale, but who was in the more recent one where he battled Superman?
Oh, Ben Affleck.
Ben Affleck. Ben Affleck and Samuel Jackson get in a car accident on Good Friday. And the whole movie is one day. And it happens to be Good Friday. And they get in a collision, and hence Changing Lanes. It's a morality play, basically. These two guys' lives are going down the wrong path. And they have a car accident, and they get in this tussle. And all day long, they're battling each other. I can't explain why and how that is, but it's really an excellent plot. And by the end of the movie, they both have fought themselves to a standstill, battling with each other, and they come to like a watershed moment, both of them. And they both realize they have to change. And Ben Affleck makes this speech at the end that I want to read to you because I think it's so fascinating what he says. he and Samuel Jackson reconcile at the end of the movie, and they're sitting there in Ben Affleck's office. He's a big shot Wall Street lawyer. And Samuel Jackson's just a little guy, telemarketer, and just, leading a very poor, simple life. And they're sitting there. And Ben Affleck's talking about, this is a pivotal moment. I know it. He can sense it. I have to make a decision. I am standing at the crossroads, and I see these two ways before me. The way of what he's seeing all around him and the path he's on, which involves a lot of injustice and a lot of deceit and a lot of theft and a lot of crookery. And then he sees the way of righteousness, and he's feeling pulled in both directions. But he's just, after this day, all the things he learned, he's just so disgusted by this way. And he's like looking and seeing the radiant beauty of goodness, of Lady Wisdom beckoning him, calling him. And he just feels drawn. And he puts it in this nuptial language that is so embedded in the book of Proverbs. So I thought it would be fitting and appropriate to read it. But here's what he says. It's like you go to the beach. You go down to the water. It's a little cold. You're not sure if you want to go in. There's a pretty girl standing next to you. She doesn't want to go in either. She sees you. And you know, if you just asked her name, you would leave with her. Forget your life, whoever you came with, and leave the beach with her. And after that day, you remember her. Not every day, every week, but she comes back to you. It's the memory of another life you could have had. Today is that girl. He sees a vision of God and his ways. Lady Wisdom beckoning him. He's standing next to her on this beach, and he's looking at the direction his life is going in, all the people he came to this beach with, his wife, his in-laws, this whole law firm he's part of and he's embedded in and married into now, and he's like seeing this whole thing, and he's like, he feels, it's like, I don't want to get into that. I don't want to immerse myself in this. It's like cold, and he sees Lady Wisdom standing next to him. She doesn't want to go in either. And he knows all he has to do is turn to her and ask her name. And they'll leave, and he'll have another life. Another life is being presented to him. The beauty of this movie, he asks her name, and he changes his life. And it is so redemptive. It is one of the best endings to a movie. I can't recommend that movie, Changing Lanes, enough, but it is laced with the book of Proverbs, or the book of Proverbs is laced into that movie. I'm telling you, it's a living incarnation of the book of Proverbs. There's so much wisdom in that movie. Now, so the beginning of wisdom, this is a great quote from the book of Proverbs. The beginning of wisdom. What's at the beginning? We said fear of the Lord. But if you had to get back to the very beginning, get wisdom. The beginning of wisdom is this. Get wisdom. Just seek it. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be answered. Open to you. Just Proverbs 4:7. The beginning of wisdom is this. Get wisdom. And chapter 2, verse 1 through 6. Listen to this. Wisdom is just calling to us. She's crying out aloud in the street to all of us. Wisdom all the time. And listen to this, 2 verses 1 to 6. My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding, yes, if you cry out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. This is very similar to the letter of James. James is kind of like the New Testament book of wisdom because it reads very much like one of these books of wisdom. And he basically says in verse 5, chapter 1, verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. You want wisdom? Ask for it. It has to begin with a seeking, a heart that desires wisdom is the starting point.